What you're watching here, this is a bit loud. What you're watching here is a film by the great Soviet director Sergei Eisenstein called October, which was officially commissioned by the Communist Party to document the revolution in a narrative that was acceptable to the state. The film was made for the 10th anniversary of the Great October Revolution, as it's called in Russian history. But the film came out, I believe, in 1929, though the 10th anniversary of the revolution was in 1927. I encourage everyone to watch it. It's quite an interesting film because it's a silent film, except for the music by the great Russian composer Shostakovich. But it's a silent film, and therefore it utilizes a lot of imagery, because most Russians in the 1920s, roughly maybe 60 to 80%, were illiterate. So the placards which have text actually weren't very communicative, so Eisenstein had to use a lot of symbols and imagery to get the point across about the revolution. You can actually watch the whole film on YouTube, which this clip is from, and I encourage you to do that. At any rate, revolutionary Russia. Well, as this poster says, the October Revolution is a bridge to a bright future. And what the revolution meant, where it stands in history, is still debated today in Russia. People are still divided on what place does this event hold in Russian history as a whole. And I think the fact that we continue to talk about it suggests that we're trying to figure out where it stands as an event in world history. A poll that was done in Russia in 2003 found that the majority of those polled found that the Great October Revolution was a positive event on Russian history. And though 33% said that the revolution boosted the social and economic development of Russia, 27% felt that it started a new era in people's history, and 18% said that it actually boosted the economic, social, and cultural standing of ethnic minorities in Russia. And when they were asked where they would stand if they were alive in 1917, vis-a-vis the revolution, and in particular the Bolsheviks, the political party that came to power, 16% said they would leave the country. 28% said they would just sit and watch and wait to see what happens. 8% said they would resist the Bolsheviks. And interestingly, I think, and this I think says a lot about where the memory of the revolution still stands in Russian society, 23% said they would provide active support for the Bolsheviks, and 20% said they might cooperate with them to a certain degree. Now, the revolution, this period of what I'm going to talk about today, 1917 to roughly the late 1930s, is one that's marked by binaries. It's marked by freedom, it's marked by tragedy, it's marked by participation, it's marked by coercive terror from the state, it's marked by death, misery, but also happiness and hope. And today the main thing I want to get across today is this contradictory feeling of the revolution. And we can sit here in 2009 and evaluate it morally, which a lot of people do and continue to do. But I think if we're really going to understand this historical event or historical process, we have to evaluate it from the time in which it took place, in the words of the people who were alive at that moment in history. Well, a bit about Russia. I don't know how much you know and how much Russia has been dealt with in this class, but to give you some general background, Russia stretches roughly 9,000 miles, a humongous country, 12 time zones. So when the sun sets in Vladivostok in the Far East, it's rising in the West. 2/3 of the country is above the 50th parallel, making it quite cold. I still have yet to understand why ancient Russians actually stayed and settled in this area, given the weather. Yerevan, the capital of Armenia, which is roughly here, is at the same parallel as Philadelphia. Very northern country. According to the 1897 census, there were roughly 150 million people living in the Russian Empire. And this consisted of 170 ethnic groups. And I think this is something that, as Americans, we don't realize, that Russia is a very diverse place, both ethnically and, as a result, culturally and linguistically. 130 languages are spoken. Only 44% of the population were Russians. And if you include Ukrainians and Belarusians, who live in the western part of the empire, they amounted to about 66% of the population. The rest were non-Russian minorities. You had a plethora of religious practices, from Christianity, various Christian sects, Catholicism, Russian Orthodoxy, which is the main church, Russian Orthodoxy. You had Protestantism, Islam, Judaism, Buddhism, and animism, especially amongst its northern native populations in the far north. Now, what was this system before the revolution at the turn of the 19th century? Well, it was an autocracy headed by a royal family, a king. Here is Nicholas II, the Romanov. The Romanovs had been ruling Russia for 300 years at this point. And nevertheless, it went through major problems of reform. In Russia, reform took basically two ways: from above, from the state instituting reforms, or at the turn of the century, from below, through revolt and revolution. The main social classes of this system were the nobility, of course, who also ruled the country at administrative purposes. You had the peasantry, who were roughly 80% of the population, living mostly at subsistence level agriculture. By the middle of the 19th century, you had the development of intelligentsia, and into the late 19th century, a radical intelligentsia of Marxists, anarchists, various types of socialists, and in their revolutionary struggle by the 1870s and 1880s to really the revolution, turned to terrorism, the assassination of Tsarist officials. In the early 1900s, they were successful in assassinating two heads of the Ministry of the Interior. In the 1870s, they were successful in assassinating Tsar Alexander II. So this movement was quite successful in its revolutionary violence, and it was growing. But by the turn of the century, most of the revolutionary intelligentsia elite were in exile abroad in Europe, in places like Switzerland and Austria. You also had, because of the industrialization efforts at the end of the century, you had a burgeoning middle class, a bourgeoisie, as Marx would call it, and a working class, a proletariat, a really rapidly growing industrial working class, especially in the capitals of St. Petersburg and Moscow. And their working conditions, of course, were horrible. Because of Russia's late industrialization, it industrialized quickly, heavily, and needed to exploit labor at a rate much faster than the long industrialization period in Western Europe. Now, why did this empire that had been existing for, at this point, almost 600 years, but the Romanov dynasty lasting 300, how did this place implode? And I mean implode literally, it just collapsing on itself in a matter of days. Well, one issue is the failure of the Tsarist political system to reform to the modernization of the economy, to reform the political system to include especially the middle classes and the working classes into its system, to allow some sort of representative government, some sort of even limited democracy. Nicholas II, when he was during his coronation, he addressed the issue of parliaments and constitutions, where he said it was sheer nonsense and fantasy to consider this for Russia. The Tsar, as almost appointed by God, consulted with God for his policy. And if he didn't consult with God, then he consulted with his wife and his ministers or his stomach. But all of this was given to him by God, so that's okay. He didn't consult with the people. They weren't there to participate in politics. Another reason for its implosion, which I will talk about in a moment, is World War I. This war devastated Russia's economy, and because of its heavy casualties, its people. And out of that, you get the loss of legitimacy on the part of the government. His ability to rule and to be the symbol of rule, to be the father of the nation, began to be undermined in popular culture. And this led to something I call dual polarization, and I'll explain what that is in a moment. Well, World War I, which I'm sure you've heard about, broke out in 1914. Russia was allied with France and England against Austria and Germany. Interestingly enough, Nicholas II's wife was German, and he was cousins of Kaiser Wilhelm II, the leader of Germany. So this war is quite interesting because it was really a war between blood relatives. In fact, his wife, Nicholas's wife, Alexandra, was related to the Queen of England also and had a good English education. Wars are always moments of truth for Russia. All of the stages of reform in the 19th century came after disastrous wars. In the 1860s, after the Russians lost a war in the Crimea against Turkey, they instituted the emancipation of the peasantry and instituted some local administrative reforms. The revolution of 1905 followed Russia's loss in the Russo-Japanese War. After they were defeated by Japan, there was a lot of political protest, and there was a massacre of working people in St. Petersburg, and this unleashed a revolution. And as a result of this revolution, the Tsar instituted some limited reforms, gave a constitution, a Duma, a parliament, but still put himself above it. Well, the war greatly strained Russia's ability to govern and to rule, and the weaknesses of this war were, first, Russia was the poorest of civilizations, i.e. the poorest of European nations, and because of its late industrialization, it couldn't maintain fighting a protracted industrialized war that used planes, bombs, poison gas, machine guns, trench warfare. Because of its centralized political system under the Tsar, there was no opening for debate. There's no space for debate amongst his ministers. At certain points, Nicholas II took personal control over the military campaign. He would make these trips to the front and make an appearance and give speeches to rally the troops. Because of its concentration, when he made mistakes, no one could criticize him. Nobody could criticize his word. And lastly, one of Russia's main weaknesses was the peasant problem. The fact that its army was drafted amongst the peasantry, who were mostly illiterate and unskilled to fight a modern industrial war. And as a result, casualties were high, into the millions. The home front, which was mobilized like every European nation to fight for the war, broke down. There were shortages in food. Industrial production was poor. And Russia just couldn't keep up with Germany, let's say, in production. It disrupted family life. Millions of young men being drafted into the army and sent to the front, which causes a lot of turmoil in one's everyday life, as you can imagine. And, of course, the political situation. At this point, there was some semblance of a parliament, though weak, not really having much power. But there was growing animosity and anger, especially amongst liberals, who were calling for some say-so in the way the state prosecuted the war and governed society. And every time Russia failed at the front, this gave them more reason to criticize and to mobilize themselves against the government. Oops. Also, all of these things culminated in the loss of legitimacy for the regime, for the Tsarist family. And this is best personified in the so-called mad monk Grigory Yefimovich Novik, or better known as Rasputin. Rasputin wasn't his real name, it was a nickname. In Russian, Raspushenia means debauchery. And he was known for this. He engaged in orgies and lots of alcohol consumption. And as a result, there were rumors flying all over Russian society amongst the educated classes, the nobility, and even in popular culture amongst workers and peasants and soldiers about Rasputin and his relationship to the Tsar. One rumor, one song that was sang around town in St. Petersburg went like this. In the Tsar's bedroom, our dark little flower has opened her petals of pleasure. In the Tsar's tower, our little Alexandra, who is the Tsarina, Nicholas II's wife, has been plucked by all the guards. And as you can see in this far left picture, autocracy is symbolized by Rasputin groping the queen's breast. Or here, the Russian Tsars at home, you can see Rasputin, the one in charge of the family. And many rumors went around. One said Grishka is governing, Grishka would be Grigory, Rasputin. Grishka is governing and getting his way with the ladies in waiting, and with Fedorovna, the empress, as well. Other rumors pointed to Nicholas II's absence as a father or his loss of paternal authority as a patriarch. When a film was showing Nicholas II awarding himself the St. George's Cross, people were commenting, he's with George, i.e. the cross, and she's with Grigory. Another said, the peasant Rasputin was all right until that old woman came along, and of course the Tsarina is only a woman, and she needed it because her husband was at the front. And there were questions of who is really ruling Russia. Is it Rasputin? Is it the German empress, Alexandra? And there were all sorts of rumors and conspiracies thinking that she was in the Kremlin or in the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, undermining Russia's war effort. The Tsar reigns, but the Tsarina governs, people would say. There were attempts to feminize the Tsar. Rasputin was called the Chancellor of the Russian Empire. Grigory I, the unofficial Tsar and Patriarch. The Tsarina her Germanness was always pointed out as a German spy or just simply a German woman. And this immoral painting of the Tsar's family made it lose its legitimacy in Russian society. And as a result, you get this dual polarization. On the one hand, you have the middle classes and even much of the nobility moving away from the Tsarist system, embracing ideas of liberalism or at the least constitutional monarchism to reduce the power of the autocracy, to have some sort of parliament. On the other wing, you have workers and peasants and the radical intelligentsia moving farther and farther away from the autocracy and moving towards ideas of socialism or anarchism, and in some cases, the use of terrorism. Because some revolutionaries felt the only way to destabilize this system is through assassination and terror. And things were so bad and gotten so heated that even foreign observers started noticing and thinking that something was amiss, something was going to happen. One American who was in Russia in December 1916 noted that in December 1916, and still more markedly in January 1917, there were signs that something important and significant was going on in Russia that required exploration, he wrote. And the rapidly growing rumors of coming political changes called for more accurate knowledge and fuller interpretation. And this was written by Nicholas Murray Butler, who is a delegate from the Carnegie Foundation of International Peace, viewing events in Russia. Well, he was quite prescient because in February 1917, the whole system collapsed. And rather rapidly, as this timeline suggests. Putilov is an important metalworking factory in St. Petersburg. It goes on strike, 3,000 workers in the street, February 18th. February 22nd, the owners of the factory lock out the workers, so they're even more in the street. The next day, which is March 8th by the old calendar, International Women's Day, where 100,000 demonstrate against the war and calling for bread. And women are going through the streets of Petrograd, which is what St. Petersburg was called at the time, calling workers out into the streets. A general strike is called 2 days later, and you get instances of the police firing on the crowds, and some instances of the crowds firing back. People are ransacking the streets, pulling police off of horses and beating them to death with whatever they can get their hands on. They are going to the houses of the rich and middle classes and demanding that they hand over their property. In the countryside, peasants are seizing land. They are hanging their landlords or burning down their manors. Revolution is at hand in a matter of days. Finally, one of the most significant things that happened is February 27th, when the Petrograd garrison, the military detachment that's stationed in the city, mutinies against the government and joins the revolution. Now, the revolution has guns. People are fleeing the front, soldiers are fleeing the front back into the cities or to the countryside, so the revolution is getting more guns. And as you can imagine, this leads to a completely chaotic situation. So much so that on March 1st, the infamous Order Number 1 is passed, which allows soldiers to elect their officers, completely upsetting the hierarchy of military organization. They ban any degradation of soldiers by officers. They institute informal address. You can't degrade a soldier in any way, even verbally. Soldiers are shooting their officers or doing other things. Complete chaos in the front. The war effort is breaking down rapidly. And under extreme pressure, both from within in his own circle and outside, Nicholas II abdicates on March 2nd. In a matter of a couple of weeks, this empire that had been existing for so long completely collapsed. And you can imagine what this was like, to have everything you know, the police, working services, just gone in a matter of days. And to replace Nicholas, to get some sort of semblance of order and to plan a new government for Russia, a provisional government forms, mostly of liberals and other former parliament members. Now, what did this revolution mean to people, to regular people? And you can see this if you look at the great archival treasure trove of proclamations and letters from workers and peasants and how they articulated their experience in the revolution. There was an adoption of many foreign terms, things like democracy, demokratia, republic, constitution, revolution, socialism, bourgeoisie, the people, and the nation were being used. You have words like liberty and freedom, languages of emancipation, freed from chains, workers and peasants were writing in their letters. The revolution offered a bright future, a new era, a great joy, happiness, a good life, a new life. This was seen by many as a point of a new future, a better future. People also spoke in terms of ethics and dignity, of duty and honor, of morality, of consciousness. Workers would express how they were conscious workers. They didn't drink like these unconscious ones. They were politically active. They participated in speeches and voting and the revolutionary process in general. They spoke of rights. They spoke of standing proud and tall. And this is a good image to how the Tsarist system is now being painted. If people are speaking of freedom and being released from chains, it suggests that the Tsarist system is oppressive and has its people in slavery. So much more, people began talking about democracy, power, and authority. What type of state should we have now that the Tsarist system is gone? Well, though many spoke of freedom and democracy, there was also a lot spoken about a firm authority, a state that would establish order, especially because crime was breaking out all over the country. Spoke of a strong democratic government, one that uses the state in the name of the poor and the people against the rich. So class is in this revolution from the very beginning. A government that expressed the people's will, a government that held up popular sovereignty, the rights of the people. As one soldier wrote, he wrote a poem called Long Live Free Russia in 1917. His name was Mikhail Serafimovich. Not a great work of art, but I think it expresses a lot. He wrote, "Long live free Russia, the joyous cry floods my soul. The red flag stills my heart. Long live our freedom. The leaden weight has fallen. A world dreams a shining dream. I'm young again, my body drunk, my soul replete with feelings as vast and endless as drops in the cup of the sea." So there's this great emotional expression, this emotional experience that the revolution produces in people. Proclamations of people writing letters to the government saying, now that everyone is free, we wanted to make use of this freedom in the same sense of self-betterment, while we need so much now for a new creative life. People wanted to be educated, wanted this government to step in and take control. Now, this initial elation quickly breaks down into polarization, where you have, on the one hand, the provisional government filled of liberals and middle-class people who want a constitution, a parliament, the rule of law, and on the other hand, the development of the Soviets, which are councils of workers and peasants that sprout up in many cities around Russia. These are highly democratic. If this was a Soviet, for example, I would speak, and then anyone else here could speak if you wanted to. If you came off the street, you can vote. Completely open. And these Soviets represented, in the minds of workers and peasants, their interests. And you could see this quite quickly. For example, the provisional government wanted to continue the war. The Soviets, workers and peasants and soldiers, wanted the war to end. The workers and the peasants, for example, wanted to seize land and take land. The provisional government wanted to wait. We have to do it through laws and legality. And this polarization between us and them is also seen in the language of enemies and friends amongst common people in this period. This is the beginning of the term enemies of the people, a term that will become used quite greatly in the Stalin period. Workers and peasants and soldiers spoke of traitors, of the bourgeoisie and kulaks, the upper classes, as accursed weeds that needed to be removed and pulled out of society. They were traitors and betrayers, counter-revolutionary imperialist bourgeoisie who were fighting a war and making profit at the expense of common people. They were enemies of the fatherland, leeches. Some referred to the bourgeoisie and middle classes as oozing scabs that needed to be scrubbed off the body of the nation. And they called for the government to be merciless against these enemies. On the contrary, when common people spoke of their friends, they used words like citizen, comrade, ideas of fraternity and brotherhood. They referred to the poor, the laboring people. So this distinction, this class distinction, was very much in the revolution from the very beginning. And something the Bolsheviks would eventually exploit, the sheer hatred that lower class people had for the upper classes. Now, what's interesting about this dual power, on the one hand, both agreed that they would wait till a constituent assembly that would happen at some point in the future, that would be a democratic vote to decide what the new state would be, what the new country would be. But in a lot of ways, the provisional government was mainly a shell, an institution. It was a government in form. While the Soviet, because it represented the vast majority of the population, roughly 80 to 90%, were really the government in content. They were the ones with the real social power. And that social power would be called upon for the interest of the democracy, the people. Enter the Bolsheviks. Enter Vladimir Ilyich Lenin, who is in exile when the revolution breaks out in February and March, and he hurries back by train with the aid of the German government, who seals him in a train car, sends him across the front, locks him in because they don't want him to infect soldiers on his way back to Russia with his crazy radical ideas. He finally arrives in Petrograd on April 3rd. His comrades come to greet him. Oh, Comrade Lenin, thank God you're here. Stalin and Molotov, two figures that will be very important in the 1930s, come to him and say, isn't this great, Comrade Lenin? The revolution is here, all the things we've been working for. Now we've succeeded. And Lenin says, bullshit. What are you people doing? The revolution is not over. This is only the first phase. There will be a second revolution. A Soviet revolution, a socialist revolution. And he immediately denounces this ideal of dual power, denounces the provisional government as merely a tool of the international bourgeoisie, and calls for Soviet power as the embryo of a socialist government. And he creates two slogans around this notion to capture the ideas of the population, the ideas of common people. All power to the Soviets, and bread, peace, land. Now, the interesting thing about these two slogans is that Lenin wasn't really inventing anything here. He was merely consolidating what was already being said by common people at the time. Peasants were calling for bread, workers were calling for bread, soldiers were calling for peace, and peasants were calling for land. And not only were they calling for it, they were taking it. Workers were taking factories. Soldiers were leaving the front in droves. Peasants were seizing land. They didn't need Lenin or the provisional government to tell them what to do. They were already doing it. Lenin is an interesting figure as the leader of the Bolsheviks, a radical Marxist party. His main principles are this idea that revolution must be prosecuted through a vanguard party of professional revolutionaries who devote their time to the struggle. Lenin's party also agitated quite heavily in factories and in the army. Its main source of support were industrial workers and soldiers, two very important staples of society in terms of power. He called for an uninterrupted revolution, a continuous revolution, to remake Russia into a socialist state, into a communist state. He called for soldiers to turn the imperialist war, which he called World War I, an imperialist war. He called for soldiers to turn on their officers and turn this imperialist war into a class war, turn this war into world revolution, which he was confident that in Western Europe, particularly in Germany, would erupt in communist revolution. In fact, he put a lot of hope on that fact. Lenin had an interesting political philosophy in the sense that, on the one hand, he had great admiration and belief in the creative initiative of individuals, of people's will to recreate society. On the other hand, he spoke of coercion and terror, and the use of the state to do what it wants, the need for what he called iron discipline amongst revolutionaries. So he had these very contradictory views of freedom and emancipation and creativity on the one hand, and the use of violence and the state and coercion on the other. And these two ideas, these two seemingly contradictory ideas, would run throughout the first 20 years of the Soviet system. Lenin was called all sorts of things. He was called an antichrist. He was called a militant in the bourgeois press. He was an uncompromising thinker. He was incredibly polemical. One socialist who knew him, named Viktor Chernov, spoke of Lenin like this: Lenin possesses an imposing wholeness. He seems to be made of one chunk of granite, and he is all round and polished like a billiard ball. There is nothing you can get a hold of him by. He rolls with an irrepressible speed, but he could repeat to himself the well-known phrase, "I don't know where I'm going, but I'm going there resolutely." Lenin possesses a devotion to the revolutionary cause which permeates his entire being. But to him, revolution is embodied in his person. Complete devotion from a very early age to the idea of revolution. Well, by October 1917, the Bolsheviks found themselves from a small, insignificant party which most people felt was a flash in the pan, that Lenin's ideas were pure madness and lunacy, to a powerful political organization. The Bolshevik Party went from 22,000 members in March 1917 to over 70,000 by October. And by September, they had captured a majority in the Petrograd Soviet, the most important political body representing workers, peasants, and soldiers. So their popularity was increased. The question is why? Why does this militant, so-called lunatic, antichrist, now getting popular support? Well, a lot of it is because the provisional government failed to deal with the pressing issues of the time. They failed to deal with the question of the war. In fact, they signed secret treaties with the West, with France, the United States, and Britain, saying they would stay in the war regardless. They wouldn't abandon their allies. They also failed to address the land question, the issue of the redistribution of land. They failed to address the economy. They kept putting everything off to this so-called Constituent Assembly, which would happen in the future. But people were suffering at the time. People wanted action. They spoke of needing action. They spoke of enough talk, enough debate. Results is what we need. And Lenin promised these results. He promised with his slogans that if he was in power, peasants would get the land, workers would get control of their workplace and their factories. The war would be ended. And by late 1917, the Bolsheviks found themselves in a right position to take power. And in October, they organized a coup. They took over the communication centers of Petrograd. They went in and chased the provisional government out of authority. In fact, many of them fled. The leader of the provisional government, Alexander Kerensky, eventually found himself in the United States and became a professor at Columbia University, as did many other liberals and Russian exiles. Why did the Bolsheviks win? Well, I mentioned the crisis of the war. There's also the weakness of moderate socialists to come and fulfill the needs and desires of the population. The moderates who are in the Petrograd Soviet, the moderate socialists, also failed to take action. And as a result, they lost support. Peace bred land, Lenin's slogan, became popular. It kind of, in this echo chamber, as they call it now. They spoke it, Lenin spoke it, they spoke it, and it just increased popularity. And in the end, one can say, and a lot of historians debate this, what is the Bolshevik takeover? Is it a coup? Was it democratic? Did they have a right? Was it illegal? All of these questions. And it seems clear to me and to many historians that the Bolsheviks really put themselves at the head of a social revolution. They rode a wave of social revolution into power. Lenin, showing his political flexibility and his ability to change his viewpoints to the people, was ushered in. When they took over in October 1917, it was merely just flicking the provisional government over. And sure enough, as soon as the Bolsheviks took power, they instituted a decree on land, giving land to peasants, which they have already had taken. A decree on peace. In fact, they ended the war 6 months later. They decreed workers' control of factories. But they also did other things, like the censorship of the press, the censorship particularly of the bourgeois press, the confiscation of printing presses, and allowing local Soviets only to give them to trusted political members, political organizations. In 1918, in early 1918, after an assassination attempt on Lenin, the Bolsheviks created a new political police called the Cheka, or as its whole name, the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution Sabotage. Now, the Cheka mostly dealt with crime, but it also dealt with what they called counter-revolutionaries and began arresting moderate socialists, liberals, officers, police officers, Tsarist officials, or anyone who put resistance to the Bolshevik government. Again, this very contradictory situation. Freedom on the one hand, coercion, the use of police and the state on the other. By 1918, the Bolsheviks, whose support was really concentrated around the center of the country, was facing a counter-revolution on the part of former Tsarist officials, nobles, and liberals who were organizing militarily in the east and in the south. And by the summer, there was full-fledged civil war, brutal civil war, the use of terror on both sides. The Bolsheviks declared a Red Terror, where they began shooting people en masse. The numbers for this range from 10 to 15,000 executions. You got the beginning of the so-called Gulag system, the prison labor camp system, so-called counter-revolutionaries were being sent. You also get development of something called war communism. And this, I think, captures, again, this contradictory situation. War, on the one hand, the use of coercion, the state, and violence, and communism, on the other, the supposed emancipation of humanity. Freedom and terror put together. But it's important to note that freedom in this revolution always meant freedom for particular people, for the lower classes. There was not much sympathy amongst the lower classes for the bourgeoisie and the nobility who were being arrested. In fact, the Bolsheviks won the Civil War eventually by 1920 because they were able to get peasants and workers to back them. Because the choice was either back to some sort of Tsarist system of oppression or the Bolsheviks, who were promising a whole bunch of stuff. For many, it was an easy question. Others, they went back and forth, depending on their own kind of situation. But what's interesting about the Civil War is, on the one hand, the sheer casualties of it. I'm looking for my numbers. I don't have my casualty numbers. I believe in this period, 1918 to 1921, there are roughly 7 million deaths from war and famine. There was a famine that broke out in 1921 in the central region that killed 1 to 2 million people. Mass death, depopulation of cities. The economy completely collapsed as a result. But nevertheless, amongst communists, the Civil War was a period of utopianism and experimentation. It was the glorious period, the real revolution. It was when most people, most pro-Bolsheviks, workers and peasants and soldiers, participated in the revolution. And this legacy of it as the real revolution would continue throughout the 1920s and eventually be revived in the 1930s. Now, this Civil War also left the party as a completely different organization. It had grown to 700,000 by 1921, of completely a new generation of communists who didn't know anything about Marx, didn't know really much about Lenin, didn't know much about socialism. But they knew who the enemy was. The enemy wasn't them. They were us, and they were them. And this dichotomy, I think, held this large, diverse party together. There also developed amongst communists a certain arrogance. The idea that the use of coercion could get you whatever you needed to get done. That because we won, we have the right to reshape society however we want, regardless of what anyone else thinks. The Communist Party, or the Bolshevik Party, became a militant, authoritarian organization as a result, far more authoritarian than it had been in previous years. And as a result of the Civil War, it had spread throughout the country and established administrative control as best it could in this period. So the party had completely changed as a result. But the stress of the Civil War and the use of war communism, which I forgot to mention, resulted in the extraction and the taking of grain from peasants, whether they wanted to give it or not, put a lot of stress on the country and really threatened Bolshevik control, Bolshevik power. In fact, Lenin was utterly surprised that the Bolsheviks won the Civil War. He didn't expect it because they were so small and weak. But they miraculously won. Nevertheless, because of the strains of the Civil War, the death, the famine, the economic dislocation, Lenin instituted a new policy called the New Economic Policy. which was going to be a period of tolerance, a retreat, as he even himself described it, a retreat from the goals of war communism, these utopian experimental ideas that communism could be established in a matter of weeks. He backtracked from this. He tried to rein in this militancy for pragmatism. He repeatedly spoke about how communists had successfully destroyed the old system. They've successfully carried out a revolution, but now they had to learn to govern. They had to learn to rule. They had to learn how to be administrators. And this always was a conflicting thing within the Bolshevik Party, because on the one hand, they'd spent most of their lives looking to destroy society. The idea of building it was a very murky thing. What would communism look like? What would socialism look like? What is the new society? All of these questions came up. And they became more important in 1924 when Lenin died of a stroke. And the party, which had been basically organized around his person, was left to his lieutenants, particularly Stalin and Trotsky, who engaged in an infighting over who should be in power. And the infight within the party took place over what the course of the regime should be. Should we go fast? Should we go slow? Should we follow Lenin's proclamation that the new economic policy allow for private trade, for private property, for the reinstitution of the class enemy, for tolerance towards class enemies, allowing shops and restaurants and cafes and all the things they saw as decadent to sprout up again? Should they move to industrialization, or should they favor agriculture? All of these questions occupied party leaders in the 1920s on at what speed should they move to this vague socialism. In society in the 1920s in Russia, it was actually not much different than most societies in the 1920s, most European societies in the 1920s. It was the Jazz Age. It was a time of sexual liberation. It was a time of mass politics and mass participation. It was a time of avant-garde art in music and literature. It was a time of relatively cultural and political freedom in Russia. There was lots of experimentation in ways of life and in the arts. But on the other hand, amongst communists, this period was the most decadent. It was a retreat. It was a sign of weakness. It was a sign of infection, and they spoke of it in terms of infection, in terms of degradation and degeneration of society. It was the emergence of the so-called Nep man, the private bourgeois trader, who, as you can see from this depiction, is certainly has its anti-Semitic tones. In fact, people referred to Jews and Nep men as almost similar creatures, similar people. But nevertheless, city life in Moscow and St. Petersburg was reviving with clubs and dance halls. People were listening to jazz. They were dancing foxtrot. They were doing the swing dance, as you see in this great movie about Nazi Germany, Swing Kids. Women, the flapper dress was in style. Foreign fashion was in style, especially amongst young people. And all of this was labeled as bourgeois, as decadence, or the Russian word meshanstvo. And communists spoke disparagingly at the Nep men and the meshanin, the bourgeoisie. In fact, one young communist, member of the Young Communist League, which is what I study, wrote a letter saying to his sister, saying, "You admonish me for how I feel about the Jews," or as he called them, the Yids. "And I will never give up my hatred for them. Just look around. Who has the best apartments? They do. Who has the wealth? They do. And the workers who sacrificed on the barricades of revolution are now exploited again. And it's the Yids, he said, who will have power. And as his closing statement, he said, I, as a young communist, will struggle against the Yids until my dying day, because this is my duty as a communist. So you get a mixture of anti-Semitism, class hatred, and a dissatisfaction with this inept society. In fact, amongst youth in particular, all sorts of styles were adopted. Here you have a picture of a flapper girl in the latest fashions. You have development of what they called in the young communist press the Red Don Juan, these young communists who essentially would use their authority to pick up women and would argue how communism is about free love and would have multiple partners as a result. You get these images of them going to dancing, jazz, smoking, alcoholism, hooliganism. And people began to ask, communists began to ask, what type of society is this? Is this socialism? This reversion back to this kind of decadence of the Red Don Juan, the communist Don Juan? In fact, in the 1920s, there were several moral panics around youth behavior, around three particular cases. One about a young communist who was charged with forcing his wife to commit suicide. Another incident in 1927 of a gang rape of a girl by 40 youths, all of them being workers and several of them being young communists. Complete moral outrage over the behavior of young people. In fact, one letter from a group of communist girls to the Central Committee, the Komsomol leadership, said this: the Komsomol needs to take immediate measures to liquidate hooliganism, which is observed in our cell. At night, the cell holds drunken parties of both sexes, after which the guys badger girls with sexual propositions. The majority of the girls agree, but those who don't are sent packing from the cell. They get expelled for not going along with the boys. And in the Komsomol in particular, it was 8 boys to 2 girls in the membership. Very, very male organization. Members from the city Raikom, the district committee, the local leadership, come to these evenings and assemble an equal number of boys and girls. Many girls are pregnant as a result and live poorly. This group, the 39 Komsomol girls who wrote this letter, have left this organization and send you an appeal for the rapid cessation of this hooliganism in our organization. So you had a lot of outcry from all parts of society about what was going on. But the question remained, what is a communist? How does a communist live? How does he or she behave in their personal life? How does one dress? Some communists felt that real militant communists wore leather jackets and boots that went up to the to the knee. They felt that wearing neckties was a sign of decadence. One Komsomol member wrote that Komsomol should take off these neckties and not walk around like little dogs in a collar. They had debates about whether one should shake hands, write poetry and love letters. They had arguments over girls, if girls should wear braids or not, or dresses, jewelry. All of these issues of how one conducted their personal life was debated in the 1920s. All of it to establish what it meant to be a communist. Now, in general, a communist meant, as you see from this list here, and the poster says, you must help liquidate illiteracy. All joined the society of down with illiteracy. Well, a communist had to be literate, had to know how to read, had to know about politics and read Lenin and other political literature from important party members. They had to be Marxists. They had to be educated and well-spoken. They had to be professional. They had to bathe regularly, to brush their teeth. Now, this seems silly, but these were actual debates. Should one bathe? How often? A communist should be physically fit. They should engage in sport. But certain types of sport should be team sports, because individual sports were seen as bourgeois. They should be collective sports. They should be an atheist. They should denounce all types of religion. As Marx wrote, the opium of the masses. There is no God, and they engaged in campaigns against the church as a result. A communist should be socially active. They should participate in politics, participate in organizations like Down with Illiteracy, and organizations like the Young Communist League and the Bolshevik Party. They should become members. They should become members of trade unions and participate. A communist should be cultured, should present themselves well, know about literature and music and theater. And a communist should treat his fellow comrades equally, whether they're women or ethnic minorities or whatever. They should have good comradely relationships. They should respect each other and not be arrogant. They should be sober and not drink. All of these things went into, in a general sense, of what a communist was supposed to be. And I emphasize supposed to be, because a lot of young, especially young communists, they may be socially active, but they drank a lot. And they didn't see a contradiction between the two, because they said, if I'm a good communist, why should my private life matter? And to enforce all of these new ways as what a communist should be, they engaged in campaigns to create a new culture, a new way of life. This poster says, "Run, guys, run. Religion is poison." And you can see here the old woman pulling her daughter to the church, and she's reaching for the school. And this was a dichotomy they played against, because education, if you were an educated person, of course you would realize that religion was all bunk and lies anyways of the bourgeoisie to keep you oppressed. This is the argument they made. So to do this, they created new holidays. Komsomol Christmas, Komsomol Easter, where youths would put on costumes of priests and mock them in a kind of carnivalesque. A lot of times this went out of hand, and young people would run through the streets and beat up priests and ransack churches. They established new holidays like May Day, Labor Day, which we don't celebrate here, but everywhere else in the world does. Revolution Day, to commemorate the Great October Revolution, November 7th. They instituted what they called red weddings and red funerals. Weddings where there was no priest, and it was just an exchange of a civic exchange. In 1920s Russia, you could get divorced just by mailing a postcard to the local marriage registration. And this even offended many communists. Even names, a new crop of revolutionary names. People were naming their children things like Nino, which is Lenin backwards, or Oktyabrina, after the October Revolution, Vladlen, which is Vladimir Lenin, Zvezdochka, which means star, particularly red star, another symbol of communism, Smena, which means change, Ucheba, which means study or textbook, and Kim, which stands for Communist Youth International. And you could still find these people in Russia who, somebody told me recently they knew a Nino. Some poor bastards were named things like Stalin. And one could imagine how this how this plays out nowadays. So there was all this kind of very intimate understandings of how one should lead one's life, even down to your name. And to do this, they created several political organizations, like the League of the Militant Godless. I always loved this one. The Bezbozhniki, as they're called in Russian. Bezbozhnik rolls off the tongue better than League of the Militant Godless. The Young Communist League, or the Komsomol, or the Pioneers, which was for children. The Komsomol was for people 14 to 23. Or Duel, which was a women's state department for women's rights. Duel was quite interesting because they tried to do things like communize child raising. Their slogans were about getting rid of the slavery of the kitchen for women. They advocated rapid divorce, this idea of the postcard to get divorced. They advocated free and open abortion. And in fact, in revolutionary Russia, women had the vote before anywhere else on the planet. In 1917, women were given the right to vote, whereas here in the United States it was, what, 1920-something? 1922? So its emancipatory aspect continued. What time is it? Oh, shit. Okay. Unfortunately, I'm going to skip far ahead because to deal with Stalin Revolution, I can't do that in 5 minutes. The couple of things I want to point out, just the photos. Here is Stalin's pipe. Here he's blowing out the wrecker, the Nepman, and the kulak, the rich peasant. And what I would like to talk about with Stalinism is that it is this continuation of this, what I call authoritarian populism. The use of terror and coercion in the state on the one hand, but also the participation of the masses, the mobilization of the masses on the other. And here is a poster for that mass mobilization and participation, calling for shock workers, these groups that would form to carry out industrial production. They would go into factories and produce and work harder than everyone else. The Stalin Revolution instituted class warfare again, the purging of the former people from Soviet institutions. It was a time of mass volunteerism, mass mobilization and participation. It had slogans like, Bolsheviks can storm any fortress. Just by their will, they can institute socialism. Here is a famous sculpture in Moscow. It's actually quite large. It probably is higher than this ceiling. It's quite an amazing piece. It's made out of iron, of steel, right? Steel sculpture of a worker and a peasant woman forming the hammer and the sickle, the ideal image of what the new Soviet person should be, the new communist person. But this new communist person was also to be a conservative one, as this kind of idyllic portrait of Stalin shows, him getting flowers from young pioneers, looking all grandfatherly. And you can look at this. I'll have them post the PowerPoint. Of course, the use of terror and the strange mix of humor. Here, there's a wonderful book called Piggy Fox and the Sword of the Revolution. It has drawings that Politburo members made of each other during meetings. This one, they're quite great. This one, Mezhuluk did a lot of these, and this is a picture of Burkhanov, who is the Minister of Finance. And in the archive, they found these in the archive, and next to this particular one, they found a little note written by Stalin. And it says, the note says, let me find the note. To the members of the Politburo, the governing body of the state, for all the sins past and present, hang Burkhanov by the balls. If his balls hold out, consider him acquitted by trial. If they do not hold, drown him in the river. Joseph Stalin. So this strange mixture of extreme violence, the mass execution of hundreds of thousands of people, and the imprisonment of millions, a famine that killed between 5 to 10 million people in 1933 and 34, went along with this strange topsy-turvy world. During the terror, for example, I could be, one of you or a group of you, maybe good Komsomol members, would stand up and denounce me as some sort of bourgeois agitator or counter-revolutionary spy, Japanese Nazi, whatever. They had long lists. I would be taken away by the police and shot, most likely. The mice bearing the cat of regular people denouncing others and having them literally taken away. The worst thing you could be in 1936 and 37 and 38, excuse me, was a Communist Party member. Most of the communist elite were executed. Now, in raw numbers, the vast majority of people who were executed are regular workers, regular people, of course. But statistically, it was the Communist Party elite that was killed the most. In fact, the infamous Order 00447, which gives quotas for execution and imprisonment. So the first category is for executions. So, you know, in what? Moscow region, 5,000 executed. Now, who knows 5,000 who? Well, the local police decides who's in that 5,000. And then the second category, 10,000 to be exiled into camps, labor camps. And this completely spun things out of control in terms of the violence. Because, as my professor pointed out, the fact that they're all round numbers suggests that they have no idea how many quote-unquote enemies there were. And in some cases, local NKVD would write to the center saying, 5,000? No, we need to do like 6. We have more enemies than you know. And then they would use that order to eliminate their own local political enemies within the party. So there were like little civil wars going on. To sum up this rather quick and porous discussion, how do we evaluate this revolution? What sense do we make of it? Is that it? Oh, okay. Well, that's it. Thank you.